Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of By the Way to Purposeful Procurement. My name is Philip Ideson. I'm the founder and managing director here at Art of Procurement. As always, I'm joined this time remotely by my co-host, Rich Ham. Rich is the CEO and founder of FineTune. Rich, thanks for joining me.
Studio's not the same without you, Phil, but it's nice to see you as always, and I'm excited for this one.
I will be back in sunny Indianapolis soon. Well,
We'll try to
today's
keep it sunny for you.
Today's conversation, we are going to be joined by Omid Ghamami, who is president of the Procurement and Supply Chain Management Institute. He's a former procurement executive in his own right. And so, Omid, I want to welcome you to the podcast.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me here.
Now, we want to talk today about talking about procurement incentive structures, which has been a key part of the series that we're recording. But you spent almost 20 years as a purchasing ops executive at Intel. You left to found the organization that you are now working with. How did that come about? Why did you do that? And can you tell us a little bit more about it?
So basically, while I was at Intel, it was never my day job, but I ended up being the global trainer for the organization. And while I was doing procurement and progressively managing larger roles, eventually running global corporate purchasing operations, I was also training the procurement organization. And then they put me in charge of all the negotiation strategies and gave me the moniker, the godfather of negotiation planning. And at that time, I felt that we were making so much traction internally. I had a bet that I could do it externally. And so that's when I started, was in 2006. And, currently we do in-house training, consulting, public speaking, and also an online and face-to-face certification program, the CPSCM. So that's kind of the shift I made out of Intel Corporation. And when you're ready, I can tell you what I've learned since then.
Well, I'd love to know a little bit about when you founded the Procurement and Supply Chain Management Institute. Kind of what problems were you trying to solve back in 2006? Because it's kind of crazy looking back, 20 years ago that you kind of set off on that journey. I know what that's like. But yeah, some of the things that you were trying to kind of look and achieving in 2006, which made you think, there's a place in the world for this.
Well, it's really interesting. So 2006 was the genesis, and then slowly but surely in 2012, PSCM Institute was formally founded. And it started with the fundamentals and improving the fundamentals, negotiations, contract law, supplier management, cost analysis, and things like that. But as I got into the profession, you see, when you're inside one company, you have a very stovepipe view. And it wasn't until I got inside of so many different companies that my perspective changed radically. I like to think I'm a much smarter and more capable person than when I left Intel. So my focus today is radically different, actually.
Yeah.
Do you think that the same problems that you were attempting to solve in 2006, broadly speaking, do they still exist today? Have they metastasized and gotten worse? How has the lay of the land within procurement evolved since you made the move?
I'll say this. In 31 years that I've been in the profession, and this is controversial, by the way, but in 31 years that I've been in the profession, I don't think we've gotten better at solving almost any problem. What we've gotten exceedingly good at is automating bad processes and expediting bad processes. I gave you the analogy outside of this meeting. It's like those guys you see in the gym who keep pushing more weight, but they're doing it with exceedingly bad form and risking injury and all sorts of things. That's kind of a good analogy for what's going on inside of procurement. And so I feel like I have an insight on things that we're doing that are really causing problems, and sort of like high blood pressure, where you can have very high blood pressure and have zero awareness because it's asymptomatic. The same thing is going on in procurement with a number of areas, and that's been where my focus has really shifted to, is creating that enlightenment and figuring out not how do we keep doing bad processes faster, but how do we surgically eliminate some of these, and how do we completely re-engineer them and then demonstrate the value proposition that awaits us on the back end.
Phil, I wonder at times how we've not spoken to Omid before today, because it seems like he is very much singing our tune. But I want to ask you, Omid, as we kind of, because when I hear you describe the state of play and how we haven't necessarily gotten better over the last 3 decades at solving certain problems, I find myself very frequently, and I'll admit, as shouldn't be surprising based on the project we're doing, I have a bit of a fixation with incentives. I think they're just really important, and so I look at the landscape and think if only the incentives were reconsidered and new and healthier sets of incentives were implemented broadly to promote better behavior and better outcomes over time, the problem would at least improve, if not entirely. Maybe not all problems can be fixed through incentives, but a lot could. And so my question for you is this: when you heard about our project, and the thesis that underpinned it, that we were exploring certain flaws in common incentive structures within corporate procurement, and the idea that those flaws are doing substantial harm to the system, both within the company's walls and oftentimes even without, what was your immediate reaction? What did you think?
I got really excited because it's at the heart of the matter to a great extent, because procurement claims victory when the contract is signed, and they claim savings based on things that have not taken place yet. They're prognosticated savings, and nobody goes back and really audits those things. It's just we take it to the bank. But the reality is the delta between cost and total cost, between known upfront costs and eventual landed costs, are where the money goes down the sink. And it struck me that that's what you're really measuring. And it's an issue. We know it's an issue, and procurement does not go back and reconcile their metrics. They claim victory and they move on to the next deal, and those things get rolled up. The bigger problem, or at least as big of a problem, is we give that money back to the business unit and then they spend it again. So we can go down that hole as well. It's got lots of cheese.
One follow up on the comment you just made. There's a phenomenon that my firm sees as we focus on indirect services, and so we see some of the most complex expenses that are most cumbersome to manage from the buyer side, and where the suppliers have the most possibilities for running their margin grabbing tactics, and also often the most time to do it, because we're talking a lot of expenses that are 3 to 5 year contractual commitments. And one thing that we see all the time, we've given it a name. We call it good contract, bad deal. And the two exist simultaneously. And I saw in real time how this problem metastasized following the Great Recession, as corporate resources were leaned out and procurement practitioners were no longer they didn't have the bandwidth anymore to engage in the joust with their suppliers over the actual money exchanging hands. It was all they could do to get contracts out the door. But as vendors noticed this vulnerability, they were re-engineering their attacks to be post-contract attacks. We'll do what we need to do to win the business, and then we'll grow margin afterwards because we're meeting no resistance, with our attacks on the bottom line. And to me, this is where the incentives have failed the business, and the P&L. The bottom line is the procurement practitioner simply isn't asked to engage in that joust after the contract goes live. As you said, they've already been rewarded. I wonder, given what you've been doing, did you observe the same thing or some similar phenomena as resources were leaned out in 2008, 9, 10, 11? How in your view did that period of time influence the profession as a whole?
Well, I could comment on that period, but it goes a lot deeper. And here's the thing. If you want to go to the heart of the root cause of almost all problems in procurement, and I promise you, you will not hear one other person in the profession say what I'm about to say. But I will argue this with anybody. The root cause of almost everything that goes wrong in procurement is because we allow the business units to focus on what they want to buy instead of on what they want to accomplish. And as a consequence, when you focus, let them focus on what they want to buy, they get goods and services, which comes with no guarantees, no assurances of total cost implications, no assurances of quality, cost, delivery, whatever, all these things, but they will get what they wanted to buy. And if you look at all the escalations that happen post contract, it's never because they didn't get what they wanted to buy. It's always because they didn't accomplish what they wanted to achieve. And that has cost and total cost implications as well. And that completely gets missed when procurement, claims victory at the end of a deal and reports up cost savings. It completely puts a blanket over this problem and pretends like it doesn't exist. It's not their intent because most people aren't aware of this problem that I just explained.
When you think about collecting the data to measure on a total cost basis, I agree with you that it's easier for us to focus on the cost of what the specific thing that we're buying, and not necessarily take into account the total cost. What kind? And when I think back to my practitioner days, I would say, well, it was really hard to get that information. Where do we get that kind of level of insight from and information from that allows us to make decisions based on total cost versus just a specific piece price?
Okay, so anything that people want to buy inside the company has already been purchased more than 100,000 times before in industry. That's the first thing we have to recognize. So in advance of any purchase, you have to talk to the people who've been buying it. So you have to tell, if you have no other options, you talk to your supplier and say, give me a list of 5 clients who've implemented this with you. And you go and talk to them. What would you do differently? What are the things where did you see costs arise and so forth? And understand all those costs and cost drivers. And then also there's the government. All those contracts are public. You can find out who owns those and what happened. You can talk to them. Then you have AI. You can find out costs and cost drivers and percentages and things like this. And then then you have your own internal business units where in most cases you've already bought these goods or services before, and you can go back and do a historical assessment. All of this is pay now or pay later, and procurement tends to pay later. We negotiate and contract for what the end user wants to buy instead of what they want to accomplish. So if you don't sit down and take the time to do this historical assessment of what have been the known cost drivers that we can put guardrails around, that we can put metrics around, that we can hold the supplier accountable to, if you don't do that up front, you will forever pay the price through the nose post-contract. And that is why we're a profession of firefighters. It's if you go and talk to procurement professionals and ask them what percentage of every day is spent in unplanned activities, the answer will be 70 to 90%. I can say that with confidence. And it's a consequence of poor deal design and setup to include not understanding the costs and cost drivers.
And unfortunately, the most talented people within the department are the best firefighters too. So they end up being the ones that get called to the scene of the blaze, when something's on fire.
Such a brilliant comment, and it's a problem in our profession. We don't reward Smokey the Bear. We reward the best firefighters. We consider them the most savvy. I don't want firefighters in my organization. I want Smokey the Bear.
Amen to that. That's fantastic. I think we have an episode title somewhere in there. The question I have for you now, Omid, is if you could wave a magic wand and change 1 or 2 or even 3 things about the ways that we currently incentivize procurement departments and the people within them, what comes to mind as the changes that you'd first want to make if you had the power to make sweeping change?
I would say one of probably the biggest thing on my bucket list is let's just think about how cost savings work. It's been our number one metric for decades. We save the business unit money. It's to a great extent real post contract. Now there's some deviation we talked about. We give that money back to the business unit and they spend it. Okay. And then we go to executives, to the C-suite, and we tell them, guys, gals, we saved you 163.5 million this year. And they say, great, that's fantastic. Where's that money? We could use it. We could really use that right now. Well, you see, we gave it back to the business units, and well, they spent it. So there's no money at all. This is just phantom savings. Basically, yes, but we really did add value. I want there to be a CFO fund established. There needs to be a business model where cost savings, where the money belongs to the enterprise and not to the business unit. And cost savings go back to the CFO fund. And this CFO has a fund where the procurement cost savings go. And then the business units, well, they're going to resent that. How do you fix that? The way you fix it is you change their performance metrics, their contributions to EBIT. And it should be shared contributions by procurement back to EBIT. And they should be recognized and rewarded for their ability to meet and exceed their performance objectives. In other words, you can't let the wheels fall off the bus, but you save lots of money while reducing their budget. And that money goes there. And then that money, then the CFO gets to decide how much of this is actually going to go back to EBIT. And then there should be some internal employee-facing initiatives. For instance, the CFO should say, thanks to these procurement and business unit savings, we're going to create an on-site daycare center. It's going to be fully funded. This is for you, the employees. And suddenly procurement starts to get goodwill internally. Suddenly business units get recognized and rewarded for cost savings instead of today where they view it as procurement as a roadblock, something they have to go through and so forth. It becomes a very shared sort of thing. And then suddenly the savings report up to the C-suite becomes real. And when they become real because they can be used towards EBIT, then you know what happened next. Then we start getting funded and resourced the same way the rainmakers do, like the sales organization. There's no such thing as an underfunded sales organization, but procurement gets funded and resourced like payroll, an organization that has to just work. And if you're hearing about them, that means there's something wrong. This solves all those problems, and it's going to end up us being better resourced and funded, and we'll be viewed and treated like a value-added center of profit.
I think there's so much brilliance rolled up in that answer, and I want to hit one or two items real quick. First of all, room on a PO is like a cordial invitation, to both the supplier to find a way for the customer to spend that money and for the customer to spend it. And as you say, I love this vision of a new world where that ability no longer exists, where it's like, no, that PO doesn't need to be at that level anymore. In fact, that savings went back to the CFO's fund to be used in some other new ways. But no, the PO was for these goods or services, and we found a way to spend less money in practice on those goods or services. So new expenses should be a new decision, but let's actually embrace and realize and enjoy the value of procurement's output there. I think that's a brilliant notion that, Phil, that we should take into our planning for the future state. I love that.
I'm interested in your perspective on it's an age-old question, and it's around cost avoidance as a value measure, and especially as we're talking savings here. What's your perspective on cost avoidance?
Cost avoidance is the best savings of all. And the reason is cost savings is a percentage. It's 5%, 10%, 15%. Cost avoidance is 100% cost savings. It's the surgical removal of costs. And so I value that above all else, virtually. So if we can figure out how to not just save a percentage of cost, but to surgically remove it in its entirety, that's a fantastic thing. I think that's great. So
So as
it
much as
should
like
be
demand,
really.
essentially.
Pardon me?
So yeah, so kind of looking at it from a demand management perspective, and managing demand, managing consumption. Um, how about when we're claiming savings that are, we've got an RFP in that the RFP was for 1 million, we ended up settling at 800,000. We're going to claim that $200,000 as a cost saving, even though it never hit the bottom line.
That's correct. I mean, with RFP, it's difficult to benchmark, right? Because by definition, you're buying something very unique. It's a supplier specific proposal. But there's the type of things I want procurement to be challenging, such as, did it need to be an RFP? And what I'm finding is, on average, my institute is finding with clients, there's 18% cost savings being left on the table because of the design of the demand was done inefficiently by the business unit, cost inefficiently. And we're not in the business of challenging that. So we accept it, and then we go and get the best price or the best lowest total cost from suppliers based on an ill-conceived demand. The best cost avoidance is done at the design stage and collaborating with the business unit to help drive out costs. So I'll give you an example. The U.S. Air Force, for decades and decades and decades, had a massive multi-million-dollar janitorial contract that required the stripping and rewaxing of floors weekly. Well, stripping and rewaxing of floors is not a performance outcome. It's an activity. And so they were, again, they weren't buying an outcome. They weren't buying what they wanted to achieve. They were buying what they wanted to buy. And so somebody smart came along and said, no, the actual outcome we want is to have the floors shall have a clean, uniform, shiny appearance, free of smudge marks and scuffs. And so they put it out there as an RFP. And guess what? Suppliers came back with requirements far less than stripping and rewaxing weekly, and nobody could tell the difference. And do you know how much money they saved on the entire U.S. Air Force janitorial? 50%. Now, if we don't go back and spend time analyzing demand, we'll forever be relegated to accepting end user design, and we'll never negotiate that out in supplier negotiations, and you'll never get it back in total cost assessments post contract. That money is hardwired in.
Yeah, no, I just to kind of follow up on that, I always see, focusing on cost to serve is a really valuable place. In the manufacturing place, we do value analysis or value engineering, but it's really looking at what are the costs that go into the provision of the service. And often it's because we have crazy requests. Like I remember kind of in the outsourcing world that I used to be in, asking for somebody to pick up the phone, in 3 seconds. You ask somebody to pick up the phone in 8 seconds, it changes their entire staffing model to support you. And it's not necessarily a noticeable change on an internal help desk. So things like that we build into scopes which drive cost, and the more effective way of stripping those out is to look at the scope rather than to try and beat up the supplier to get a little bit of savings out of their margin.
Well, and guess what? We suffer a bit in procurement from well-intentioned arrogance, and I say that because we assume the answers for everything must come from within our 4 walls, especially in order for us to get credit, which is a very flawed assumption. In fact, I think we need to embrace, and the sooner we embrace this, the better off we are, that the smartest person in the room is always the supplier. And that has always been considered sacrilege to say that, to believe that, but it's true. Because you're buying 1,000 different things. They're selling one thing, and they do it all day long. They go inside all sorts of companies. They know what works. They know what doesn't. And unfortunately, they've been taught that customer service means the customer is always right. And that's not a proper perspective. The first thing we need to tell suppliers is your job is not to do what I ask you to do. Your job is to make sure you have a really good understanding of what it takes for me to be successful and to make sure I am successful. And if I ask you to do something that's not smart, if I present a custom specification when we could go standard, if I have bells and whistles that are unnecessary, if we gold plate something when it's not needed, I want you to tell me. And that's your job. If you want to keep this business long term, that's what you need to be actively doing. So that paradigm needs to be reset, and we need to rely on suppliers more.
I want to pick up on two threads, and perhaps even introduce a third one in this question, Omid. You said two things that really resonated with me. One, that the supplier is always the smartest in the room, and then before, in your prior answer, you had talked about how very frequently, you think that, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, but it sounded like you would have argued that there's a lot of wasted energy in RFPs, frequently at times where they may not be as needed as one might think, or as valuable as one might think. I have actually witnessed in recent years, partly by virtue of the supplier always being the smartest one in the room, that with increasing frequency, the RFP is often unintentionally becoming an invitation for the incumbent supplier to increase prices and increase costs, because they see any number of things. One, that the customer really poses no genuine threat to go anywhere. There is something in the way the RFP was run that has told the incumbent, you're just fine, and this is the best thing they could come up with to try to put you in a quote-unquote competitive situation, but you're really not. Or there are flaws in the way the RFP was structured that betrayed the customer's ignorance about the expense, and as a result, the vendor went, well, I get this, but they don't, and here's how I'm going to increase their costs. Part of the challenge, though, and I want to just let you riff in any direction that you feel inclined to on this topic, but I think part of what is making this increasingly more and more of an issue is industry consolidation in one industry after another, where, an RFP is launched, and 15 years ago it might have been launched to 6 viable national players. And today it's launched to 2.5, 2 or 3 in most industries, where the rest of the industry is consolidated under 2 or 3 leaders, and there's only so many options, and you might have used one of the other options in the past and didn't go well. And so I think the threat of lost business has been steadily eroded by virtue of all these factors, and as a result, the RFP has become, oftentimes not only a less effective tool, but sometimes even a damaging one. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so you asked a lot of things, and it's
I did.
true. RFP can become a damaging tool, because you could open yourself up to very complicated solutions, and by definition, you usually end up doing something that is not off the shelf, whatever it is, service or good, which creates cost and creates total cost. You talked about, and so a lot of times costs get created. How do I see it? Gets created by going custom instead of standard, by not reusing existing solutions, by solving a problem with the wrong solution, by having bells and whistles that aren't needed, by gold plating something that's unnecessary. All of those things drive it. Now, you talked about industry consolidation, and when you say that, procurement often thinks, okay, less competition, and then how do I extract results in a less competitive environment? I want to just plant a seed for everybody. For 50 years, the Japanese supply chains have been the best in the world, and they do it with complete consolidation, without changing suppliers, with suppliers who know they've got the business in the bag no matter what, unless, it'd have to be a complete scandal, something very, very bad for them to lose the business. When they start failing to perform, instead of getting cut off like we do in the US, they get invested in by the supply chain. They get invested in by the company that's contracted with them, and so forth. And we have a few companies in the US that do that too. McDonald's is a good example. where they don't have this chain churn. And when one company is struggling, not only does McDonald's step in, they make their competitors step in and help make them be successful and build them back up. So I'm not sure if it's what you said, but this industry consolidation, I don't want this to raise a red flag in the eyes of people that less competition is necessarily a bad thing. The future is less supply chain churn. The future is less supply chain turnover. You need to get good at extracting maximum cost savings, maximum efficiency, maximum everything in a supply chain from the same suppliers. And this idea that we're just going to keep swapping suppliers every time they falter, every time price isn't what we like, every time, whatever it is, isn't going to be acceptable in the future. We need to get good at extracting value and increasing shared value with a set of limited supply chain partners. That's the future. So the time to get good at it is now.
Such a great answer.
Yeah, and I just want to wrap up. There's probably a lot of threads I could pull on that one as well. I spent a lot of time in automotive in the US side of things and saw what we did in the US differently versus a lot of the Japanese manufacturers that alluded to some of the things that you talked about. But I know I need to kind of bring this back to incentives as we wrap up the conversation. When we think about the role of procurement and increasing the relevance of procurement within the C-suite, how that ties back to incentives, are there things that you would kind of recommend that procurement leaders look at to think about how they're positioning our value proposition, how they're measuring our success with leaders outside of procurement that helps us take more of a proactive strategic role that gets permission for us to take that role within the business as opposed to essentially a back office service provider?
I'd like to answer that question and also expand upon it a little bit. I'm going to highlight a couple of companies that I've worked with. One is Shell Oil, and something they did was procurement was only allowed to take cost savings on business unit budget reductions. And so the CFO had a very tight focus on how much could they reduce the business unit budgets. I'm assuming then perhaps that did go to a central fund. Something happened with that money, but there was a correlation. The other thing that I saw that fascinated me most of all of any client was Mercedes-Benz. They put procurement and engineering and had them reporting to the same person. And when they did that, and they made them have a set of shared performance metrics. What that drove was collaborative cost engineering breakthroughs that would have never happened. And it got rid of this us versus them and so forth between the organizations. So that's a little bit of some procedural things. Procedural. Now, to more directly answer your question, I think the first thing we need to do is we need to start viewing ourselves as business unit enablers. We don't exist as a company to procure. We exist as a company for the business unit to drive operations. So if we enable the business unit success, and if we tell ourselves the only reason we exist is to help the business unit succeed at the lowest total cost, then in it for us, which is how we're today, and we start focusing on what's in it for the business unit, and then we stop being viewed as a roadblock. How does that tie to incentives? The business unit is the one that has to tell the C-suite how much value procurement is adding in terms of cost savings and things like this. Today, it's us. It has to be a third party inside the organization. The second thing we need to do is we need to stop focusing on just cost savings. We need to start focusing on contributions to EBIT. That's how we need to be rolling up our figures, is contributions to EBIT, and also capturing this total cost window that you folks are working so hard on. We need to focus on design cycle acceleration, and then savings driven by surgical removal of costs from product and service design, just like the example I gave with the Air Force janitorial. So this cost avoidance, surgical removal of costs. And then as we do these things, to kind of put a bow on it, the worst marketing organization inside the company is procurement. we do a terrible job of just making the company aware, general employees aware of the value we add and changing the perspective of what procurement is. If you want to know who to learn from, it's the HR organization. They constantly, they're sending out memos, they're putting posters everywhere. You go to the cafeteria, you got these tabletop things, they've got open forums, they've got, whatever, raffles, they've got HR does a great job of marketing their value add to the company. And we're in the back office because we put ourselves in the back office. So first we have to do the right things right. Then we have to know how to market better and how to talk about, our contributions to EBIT. And then part of what we need to do is give the business units lots and lots of credit so they don't feel left out and they feel like they're getting recognized and it's collaborative. All of these things are necessary to help get us a spot at the C-suite and to do so with the changing of incentives we report.
Wow. Phil, what a tour de force answer that was from Omid. I feel like that was a drop the mic moment at the end here. But Omid, you've given us so much to think about. I'm so glad we have a transcript of these interviews that we can consult, because I could never do justice by memory to all the useful nuggets that you've provided us with. But you've really provided the perfect launching pad into our plan building phase, as we enter that phase of this project, as we kind of round for home here after 20 plus episodes. So I can't thank you enough for being so generous with your time. And wow, you've given us so much to think about and to work on in the weeks and months ahead.
My pleasure. I'm so happy to be here. I really appreciate it, collaborating with your organization.
Phil,
thank you very much for joining us. Yeah, thank you very much for joining us. I mean, if anyone is listening, is interested to check out some of your work further, I'd just recommend that they look up the Procurement and Supply Chain Management Institute. Also, I'm sure they can connect with you on LinkedIn as well if they'd like to reach out direct.